The snow started before noon, and by 4 in the afternoon it had turned serious, the kind that comes down without apology and sticks to everything.
Come in
it
quickly.
touches.
It's a real
The
storm
roads
out
into
there.
Calverton went quiet early. Porch lights came on
Thanks.
before dark.
Glad I made
Smoke
it.
rose from chimneys all through the valley. And in the windows of houses, you could see the blue flicker of televisions and the soft amber glow of Christmas trees. All the small
Just
signs
rest
that people settled in.
easy.
People with somewhere to be and someone
I
to be there
won't
with.
leave
Eleanor Briggs
you.
noticed all of it from behind the wheel of
I
Harold's
said
truck.
move.
It
You
was
need
a
to leave right now.
2009 Ford F-
I'm not going anywhere
150
until we
dark
settle
green
this.
with a crack across
This
the
is your
lower
last
corner of the
chance.
windshield that had been there since the summer Harold backed out of the feed store lot without looking. She had not fixed it. She had not been able to bring herself to do much of anything to the truck since March. The crack was his crack. The coffee ring on the cup holder was his coffee ring. The little magnetic compass stuck to the dashboard that had not pointed true north in 11 years was his compass, and she left it exactly where it was, even though it pointed roughly southeast and was wrong by almost 40 degrees. She drove through Calverton, slowly past the hardware store, with the plywood Santa in the window, past the church where she and Harold had sat in the same pew for 31 years, past the lot where the Christmas tree stand had been set up and then taken down, and now was just a rectangle of brown pine needles poking through the snow. The town was quiet the way small towns go quiet on Christmas Eve, not empty exactly, but settled the way a house settles when everyone inside is finally still. She had told Sandra she was fine. She had told Gary she was fine. She had been telling people she was fine since the morning she found Harold on the hallway floor with one boot on, and one boot off his left hand still reaching for the lace, and the look on his face not pain, just surprised, as if something had interrupted him mid-thought, and he had gone away before he could finish it. The paramedics came, the neighbors came, the pastor came, the casseroles came for 3 weeks. And through all of it, Eleanor said she was fine. She had good days and bad days. She was keeping busy. She was managing. She was not managing. She was moving through rooms that still smelled like him drinking coffee from mugs, that still had his fingerprints worn into the handles, sleeping on her side of a bed that felt twice as wide as it used to. She was calling her daughter on Tuesday nights and her son on Thursday mornings and saying the right things in the right order and hanging up feeling more alone than she had before she picked up the phone. She was going to church on Sunday mornings and to the grocery store on Wednesdays and to the doctor when she had to, and she was doing all of it with a kind of careful competence that fooled everyone who was not paying close attention. Harold would have paid close attention. He always had. 53 years of marriage, and the man still noticed when she was holding something back. He would sit across from her at whatever table they were, at whatever diner or kitchen or porch, and he would not say anything. He would just look at her over his coffee cup with those gray eyes that had seen too much and give her the time she needed to find whatever it was she needed to say. He never pushed. He never fixed. He just stayed, and his staying was the thing that made her feel like the world had a floor. Without him, the world did not have a floor. She pulled into the lot of Ruby's roadside at 10 minutes after 6 and sat in the truck for a full 2 minutes before she got out. The diner was a low building on the south edge of town, sided in white aluminum, that had gone slightly yellow at the corners with a red neon sign in the window that said open, and a smaller one below it that said all night Christmas, and a hand-lettered cardboard sign taped to the glass door that said sweet potato pie tonight in Ruby Carver's blocky handwriting. The lot had 8 cars in it, not many but enough noise, enough light. Eleanor got out of the truck. She put on the blue wool coat, the one Harold had bought her 2 Christmases ago, the one he said made her look like a movie star. She buttoned it to the top, pulled her gloves on, and walked across the lot through the falling snow. The little bell above the door jingled when she pushed it open. Ruby looked up from behind the counter. She was 60 years old, wide through the shoulders with gray hair, pulled back in a bun, and an apron that said, "From Ruby's Kitchen" in stitched red letters across the front. She had been running this place since her husband passed 14 years ago, and she had never once considered closing it, because as she put it, a town without a diner is just a map with a blank spot. "Merry Christmas," Ruby said. "Merry Christmas," Eleanor said. "The usual, please." Ruby poured the coffee before Eleanor even got her coat off. Eleanor settled into the booth in the far corner, the one by the window where you could see the lot and the highway beyond it. She and Harold had sat in this booth every Christmas Eve for 34 years. It was a thing they did not plan and did not talk about. It just became true over time, the way the best traditions do, simply by repeating it until it was part of who they were. She set her gloves on the table. She wrapped both hands around the mug. She looked out at the snow coming down across the lot and the darkness beyond the reach of the parking lights, and she stirred her coffee even though she had not put anything in it. The other customers moved around her the way water moves around a stone. Families finishing up early suppers, bundled kids already in pajamas under their coats. Two men in flannels at the counter. A young couple in the middle booth barely talking, which might have meant they were comfortable with each other, or might have meant they were not. Ruby moved between tables and behind the counter and through the kitchen door, carrying plates and refilling cups and saying something to everyone because Ruby always said something to everyone. It was simply how she was built. Twice Ruby came to Eleanor's booth. The first time she refilled the coffee and set a hand briefly on Eleanor's shoulder and did not say anything, which was the right thing to do. The second time she came, she sat down across from Eleanor for 3 minutes and asked about Sandra and Gary. And Eleanor said Sandra was good. Gary was good, both of them busy, you know how it is. Ruby nodded. She said, "You call me if you need anything tonight." Any hour, Eleanor said she knew. Ruby looked at her a moment longer than the answer required and then got up and went back to work. By 7:30, two of the families had left. The couple in the middle booth had gone. The flannels at the counter were on their third cup. Eleanor's coffee had gone cold, and Ruby had come back to pour it fresh, and now it was going cold again. Eleanor was looking at the window, but she was not seeing the lot or the highway or the snow. She was seeing Harold's hand on the hallway floor, still reaching his fingers curved toward the lace of the boot he had not finished putting on. She was seeing that, and she was not crying because she had not cried since March, and she was afraid of what would happen if she started. That was when the sound came. She heard it through the window, first low and distant, a kind of rumbling that was not thunder. Then she heard it through the floor, a vibration that moved up through the booth seat and into her spine. Then she saw the lights one after another sweeping across the ceiling of the diner as vehicles turned off the highway into the lot. The men at the counter looked up. Ruby set down the coffee pot and stood still. Eleanor turned her head to the window. There were motorcycles in the lot. She counted them as they pulled in slow, one after another, headlights cutting through the falling snow. She counted to 9, then 12, then lost track as they arranged themselves in a row along the front of the building, engines grumbling and then cutting out in sequence, each one leaving a silence that the next one briefly filled. The riders climbed off, big men, all of them in leather and denim and heavy boots. They stamped the snow from their feet in the lot. Some of them stretched. One of them pulled off his helmet and shook the ice from his beard. Their breath rose in white clouds in the cold air. Then the door opened and they came inside. The man who came in first was the biggest. He stood 6'3", at least maybe 260 pounds, with a beard gone gray at the edges and a face that had been weathered by roads and years into something that did not invite casual conversation. He wore a cut the leather vest that bikers wear over their jacket, and across the back of it, in arced letters, it said Iron Vale, and below that, North Carolina. He moved through the doorway with the careful economy of a large man who has learned to be aware of his size in small spaces, and he stood just inside the door and looked around the room with dark eyes that missed nothing. Behind him came the others, 22 of them in total, filing in out of the cold, their boots tracking snow across the linoleum, their voices a low murmur as they took in the diner around them. They were not loud. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed. She had expected loud, but they came in quietly the way men do when they are road-tired and cold and want heat and coffee and nothing complicated. But the room was already complicated by their presence. The men at the counter had gone still. The family in the far booth had drawn together, the mother's hand on her child's arm. Even the kitchen had gone quiet, the clatter of pans stopping, as if whatever was being washed had been set down carefully in the sink. The diner held its breath. Ruby stepped out from behind the counter. She planted her feet the way she always did when she needed to be the person in charge of a room, and she looked up at the big man without flinching. "Help you tonight," she said. The big man looked at her. His name was Vance Holden. He was 49 years old, and he had been riding with Iron Vale for 21 years, the last 8 as president. He had started the club with 2 other men in a rented garage outside Asheville and built it up slowly, honestly, the kind of club that did not advertise itself and did not need to. His men were mechanics, veterans, tradespeople. They had rules and they kept them. They were not looking for trouble. Tonight they were just cold. "We're passing through," Vance said. "Tire truck broke down. Looking for coffee and something to eat." He paused. "If that's all right." Ruby held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down. I'll get you set up." Vance nodded once. He turned to his men and said something low that Eleanor could not hear, and the group began to spread out and find seats, pulling up chairs, sliding into booths, a couple of them settling at the counter. They did it without pushing or rushing, with the practiced order of men who traveled together and had learned to move as a group without getting in each other's way. Ruby was already moving behind the counter, pulling down cups, starting another pot, and Vance Holden was looking across the room. He saw Eleanor the way you see something that stops your eyes from moving further, a thing that catches and holds. She was in the corner booth alone, both hands wrapped around a mug that was clearly not warm anymore, looking out the window at the snow. She was a small woman, fine-boned, with white hair cut close, in a blue wool coat still buttoned to the top, as if she had not quite made herself fully comfortable enough to take it off. Her face was still, not peaceful still, the other kind. Vance had seen that look before. He had seen it on his mother's face the last time he visited her at the facility in Boone, 2 years before she died. He had walked into her room and she had been sitting in the chair by the window looking at the parking lot below, with exactly that expression, that particular quality of stillness that is not peace but the absence of enough reason to move. She had not heard him come in. He had stood in the doorway for a long moment watching her. And what he had felt in that moment was not pity exactly, but something older and less nameable, a kind of recognition that lives in the body rather than the mind. He had not made it back in time when she died. He had been on the road outside of Statesville when his phone rang, pulled over on the shoulder of 40, and sat there in the dark for 45 minutes with his helmet in his hands. He had never told anyone that. It was not the kind of thing he talked about. But he had carried it, since the way you carry things that do not have words yet, somewhere behind the sternum, where they press when the air gets thin. He crossed the diner. He did not hurry. He walked between the tables with the same careful deliberateness he always moved with, and he pulled out the chair across from Eleanor Briggs, and he sat down. She turned from the window. She looked at him the way you look at something unexpected, fully, and without flinching, taking him in from the beard to the cut to the scarred knuckles on the table. She held his eyes for 3 full seconds. Most people looked away from Vance Holden before 3 seconds were up. Eleanor did not look away. He said nobody ought to spend Christmas Eve alone. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she said, "Well, then I suppose you'd better sit, because I've been alone since 6 o'clock, and this coffee's gone cold twice already." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the precondition of one. He turned his head and raised 2 fingers toward the room, a small signal, and 4 of his men saw it and started moving tables toward the corner. Within 5 minutes, Eleanor's booth was no longer a corner. It had become the center of something, chairs pulled in from every direction, a second table dragged over and pushed flush against hers. 2 of the larger men sitting sideways because there was no other way they fit. Ruby came over with a fresh pot and a look on her face that Eleanor could not entirely read, somewhere between wariness and wonder. "Coffee for everybody," Ruby said. The table said yes in various ways. Ruby poured and went back for more. The man to Eleanor's left introduced himself as Silas. He was the biggest of them, a wide man, with arms that strained the seams of his jacket, and a face that had taken some hard weather and come through looking like it had earned the right to be exactly as rough as it was. He was 44 years old. He worked on heavy equipment when he was not riding. He did not say much at first. He watched the table the way a man watches when he is deciding whether it is safe to say anything. Across from Silas was Dawson, the youngest at the table, maybe 31 or 32, with a lean face and eyes that moved faster than the rest of him. He ordered eggs and toast and ate with the focused attention of someone who had not eaten since morning. There were others whose names Eleanor learned slowly. Preston, a compact man of 50 with a silver ring on his right hand. Wallace, who laughed easily and often. Garner, who did not say much but nodded in a way that made you feel heard. And a dozen more behind them at the other tables and at the counter, their voices forming a low background hum that had replaced the silence of the diner with something warmer. Ruby brought pie. She had not been asked to bring pie. She simply brought it, slicing it behind the counter and carrying out plates of it without comment, and Vance looked up when she set a piece in front of him, and he said, "We didn't order that." "I know you didn't," Ruby said. "It's Christmas." And she walked away. Eleanor watched this and felt something shift slightly inside her, some small adjustment of weight. They began to talk. Not about easy things. About the hard things, the kind that build up over years and press against the inside of the chest and do not get said at most tables because most tables do not feel safe enough to say them at. But something about the snow outside and the warmth inside and the strangeness of the night made the safe feeling possible. And the men around Eleanor began to open up the way men open up when they are tired enough and the hour is late enough and there is someone present who clearly has no agenda for their pain. Vance talked about his mother. He did not begin with it. He came to it sideways through a conversation about holidays and distance and what it means to be on the road when you should be somewhere else. He said her name was Helen. He said she had been in a care facility in Boone for the last 3 years of her life and that he had visited when he could, but that could had not been often enough. He said she had died on a Thursday afternoon in October and that he had been on the road and had not made it back in time. He said he still had her name in his phone. He had not been able to take it out. He said this to the table, not to Eleanor, specifically looking at his coffee cup. But Eleanor heard it the way you hear things that are meant for you, even when they are aimed at the air between people. She said, "What was she like?" Vance looked up. "She was particular," he said, "about everything. The way the coffee was poured, the direction the towels were folded. She had a system for everything, and if you did not follow the system, she would show you not mean about it, just very clear." He paused. "She made the best biscuits I ever ate. I tried to get the recipe when she was sick, and she said she would write it down, but she never did." Eleanor said Harold used to make cornbread. Same thing. "Every Sunday morning for 53 years, and I never once asked him how. I just ate it." Vance nodded. She said, "I suppose we assume there's more time." He said, "Yes, I suppose we do." Silas set down his fork. He looked at the table for a moment, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a wallet old and thick and held together at the spine with a rubber band. He opened it carefully. He took out a photograph small and creased down the center from being folded and opened too many times, and he set it on the table. It was a school photograph. A girl, maybe 16, with dark hair and a small smile that had something careful about it. "Her name is Kayla," Silas said. "She'll be 18 in February." Eleanor looked at the photo and then at Silas. "She hasn't spoken to me in 4 years," he said. "Her mother told her things. Some of them were true." He stopped. "Most of them were." He stopped again. "I wasn't there the way I should have been when she was little. I was writing. I was working. I had reasons that felt real at the time and don't feel like much now." He tapped the photo with one finger just barely. "She has my eyes. Same exact color." Eleanor looked at the photograph more carefully. She said, "She looks like someone who's going to be all right." Silas looked at her. She said, "Children who are hurt aren't always broken. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right moment to come back." Silas said nothing. He put the photograph back in his wallet and put the wallet back in his pocket with the same care he had taken it out with. Then Eleanor said, "A letter has to be opened to be read, but a letter that came back unopened still had to be held first. She had to carry it to the post office herself. That is not nothing." Silas looked at her. She said, "Maybe next time something she can hold without having to open it. Something small." He said, "Like what?" She said, "What is she like?" He said after a pause, "Horses. Since she was small. We used to drive out on Sundays to a farm on the county line just to watch them in the field. She never wanted to ride, just watch." Eleanor said, "Find her something small with a horse on it. Don't send it with a letter. Don't explain it. Just let it arrive and let her wonder if you remembered." Silas held very still for a moment. Then he said, "That's a good idea." She said, "Harold gave me things like that, small things. No occasion, no explanation. He just remembered. After 53 years, I still have all of them." Silas looked at her with something in his face he usually kept farther back. He said, "Did he know he was doing something right?" Eleanor said, "I don't think he thought about it at all. He just paid attention. That was Harold's gift." Dawson across from him was looking at his plate. He said without looking up, "My brother died on Thanksgiving 2 years ago. He said it the way you say something you have been carrying at the front of your chest for a long time and have been waiting for a moment to set it down somewhere. He said, I found him. He did not say more than that. Eleanor did not ask him to. She reached across the table and put her hand on his wrist, just for a moment, just enough. Then she moved her hand back. "That's all right," she said. "You don't have to say anything else." Dawson looked up. He nodded once short and quick and then looked back at his plate. The diner was warmer than it had been. Outside, the snow had not stopped, but it had slowed slightly, the flakes coming down bigger and softer, falling against the windows, with a sound like something settling. Ruby had turned the radio up, just barely, something quiet and instrumental that moved through the room without demanding anything from anyone. Vance had been watching Eleanor while the others talked. He was trying to understand her. She was 82 years old and she was alone in this booth, and she had not flinched once. Not when 23 bikers walked in, not when Silas pulled out his daughter's photograph, not when Dawson said the thing about his brother. She sat with each story the way a deep river sits with whatever is thrown into it, taking it in without being changed by it in any visible way. Just present and still and deep enough to hold it. He said, "What about you?" Eleanor turned from the window. He said, "You're here alone on Christmas Eve. You don't have to tell me anything. But I'd like to hear it if you want to say it." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She set both hands flat on the table. She said his name was Harold. He died in March. Stroke took him while he was putting on his boots in the hallway. "I found him on the floor." Vance was quiet. She said, "We sat in this booth every Christmas Eve for 34 years. He always ordered the same thing. Coffee, black pie. They had it sweet potato, if they didn't. He held my hand under the table, even after 53 years, when no one was looking. Sometimes when people were looking too, he was like that." She stopped. The diner moved quietly around her. She said, "I drove myself here tonight because I could not stand being in that house with the quiet. It's a particular kind of quiet, like a room that still has a shape in it, but the shape is empty. Do you know what I mean?" Vance said he did. She said, "I haven't cried since March." Vance looked at her. She said, "I'm afraid that if I start, I won't know how to stop." He reached across the table and put his hand on top of hers. Not gently, not roughly, just there. His hand was large and scarred and had grease still worked into the lines of the knuckles from years of engines, and her hand beneath it was small and thin-boned and very still. He did not say anything. He did not try to solve anything. He just left his hand there and let the silence hold what it was holding. Eleanor looked down at their hands. Then she looked out the window. Outside, the snow was falling, soft and steady. The parking lot was white and empty except for the motorcycles in a row, their chrome catching what little light there was. Beyond the lot, the highway was dark and still. Beyond the highway, the hills of western North Carolina went up into the dark ridge after ridge, carrying their snow, the way they had carried every winter before this one, and every winter that would come. There was a long time with nothing that needed to be said. Then Silas started telling a story about the time he tried to make Kayla a birthday cake when she was 9. He had found a recipe online, which was his first mistake because he had never once used a recipe for anything and did not understand why people thought they were a good idea. He had gotten the measurements wrong in 3 separate places. He put it in the oven. 20 minutes later, the smoke alarm was screaming. His dog, a shepherd mix named Colonel Ursula, ran out the back door when he opened it to let the smoke out and was found 3 hours later at a neighbor's porch 2 miles down the road. By the time the volunteer fire department showed up, the cake was a black disc that smelled like burnt chemical, and Kayla was standing in the kitchen in her birthday dress laughing so hard she had hiccups. Eleanor started laughing. Not a polite laugh, a real one, the kind that starts deep and comes up through the chest and makes your eyes water. She pressed a napkin to her face and laughed, and Silas laughed, and Vance laughed, and around the table the others laughed too, and it moved through the room the way laughter does when it is real, like something that does not need permission. The other customers looked over. Some of them smiled without knowing exactly what they were smiling at. Ruby stood behind the counter with her arms crossed and a look on her face that was quietly the most Christmas thing in the room. And for a little while, for just a little while, the night found its shape. The snow kept falling outside, the coffee stayed warm, and the corner booth that had been the loneliest spot in the room an hour ago was now the warmest place in Calverton. But nothing that good ever stays simple for long. The door opened. 2 men came in out of the snow. The first was tall, maybe 45, in a canvas hunting coat with a blaze orange stripe across the chest, a cap pulled low over pale eyes that moved around the room with the quick assessment of someone who has walked into situations before and has opinions about them. The second was shorter, heavier, through the middle, red-faced from the cold or from something he had been drinking before he came, moving with a slightly too deliberate gait of a man making sure his steps are landing where he intends them. They stomped their boots at the mat. They looked around. The tall one saw the bikes through the window. He saw the vests. His face changed in a way that was specific and not friendly. He nudged the shorter one and said something that did not carry. They sat at the counter. They ordered coffee. They watched the corner booth. They watched it for 5 minutes, then 10, and in that watching there was something that was not just looking. Ruby watched them watching. Vance noticed but did not react. He had been in enough rooms where men watched him from the side to know the difference between curiosity and intention. This was intention. He could feel it settling into the room like a change in pressure. He kept talking, but a part of him had already shifted into a different kind of attention. The tall man stood up. He walked across the room. He stopped at the edge of the table. He looked down at Vance the way men look when they have already decided the outcome of a thing and are just waiting for the first move. "You boys lost," he said. Vance did not look up immediately. He was finishing a sentence to Silas, something about a road in Virginia, and he finished it at his own pace. Then he turned his head slowly and looked up at the man. "No," he said. "We're right where we're supposed to be." The man's jaw tightened. He said, "This is a family place. People bring their kids here." "We can see that," Vance said. His voice was flat and even. Not angry. Not yet. "Then maybe you can see you are making people uncomfortable. Maybe you ought to finish up and get moving." Now here was the thing about Vance Holden. He had spent 21 years hearing this. Different words, same meaning every diner and rest stop and gas station from Asheville to the state line. Men who looked at the cut and decided what was inside it without asking. He understood the reflex. He had his own reflexes about certain things. But he was sitting in a booth with an 82-year-old woman who had nobody on Christmas Eve, who had driven herself through a snowstorm just to be somewhere with other human beings in it, and this man in a hunting coat was telling him to leave. That was not something Vance was going to do. He stood up. He was a full head taller than the man. He stood slowly, not as a threat, just as a fact. He looked at him with the patient, settled look of someone who has been in enough actual trouble to know the difference between trouble and theater. "We were invited," Vance said. He looked at Eleanor. "By her." The tall man looked at Eleanor. Eleanor straightened her back against the booth. She set down her coffee cup with a precise, quiet click. She folded her hands on the table, and she looked at the man with the pale eyes with an expression that contained no uncertainty whatsoever. "They're with me," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Every word landed in the room with the specific weight of a woman who has lived long enough to be done with the part of life that apologizes for taking up space. The tall man opened his mouth. He closed it. From the counter, the shorter man spoke up. His voice was too loud, the way voices get when a person wants a room to hear them. He said, "I already called it in. Cops are on the way." And just like that, the air in the room changed. It was not the same kind of tense as before, for it had been the civilian kind, the kind that comes from unfamiliarity and presumption and could be dissolved with enough ordinary humanity. This was different. This was the kind of tense that had legal weight behind it and history behind it in the specific compounding complexity of men who could not afford a new police report. Two of the younger riders shifted in their seats. Dawson looked at his plate. Someone at the back table said something low. Vance felt the shift in the room the way you feel it when you have lived inside enough rooms like this, the moment when the math changes and what was manageable becomes something else. He turned to Eleanor. He said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry about this. We don't want to bring trouble to your night." He began to stand. Behind him, two of his men were already pushing back their chairs. Eleanor reached out and took hold of his wrist. She did not take it gently. She grabbed it with both hands, thin fingers wrapping around the bone and holding on the way a person holds on to something when letting go is not acceptable. He stopped. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her. "I said, sit down." The tall man said, "Lady, you don't know who these people are." Eleanor turned her head and looked at him the way you look at something that has said the wrong thing at the wrong time to the wrong person. Her chin was up. Her hands were still on Vance's wrist, anchoring him in place. And then she said something that came up from somewhere beneath planning, from someplace where all of it had been living since March. The 9 months of fine, the 9 months of I'm managing, the 9 months of yes, I'll be all right, the 9 months of watching the world walk past a corner booth where a woman sat alone with cold coffee. She said, my husband fought in Korea. He came home with a purple heart and a limp he carried for 47 years. And when he walked into rooms, people moved their children away from him because he had scars and because he looked like something they didn't understand. He gave everything he had for this country, and people treated him like a danger because he didn't fit what they expected. She paused. She looked at Vance. She looked at the others. She said these men rode through a snowstorm on Christmas Eve, and they did not have to stop, and they did not have to come inside, and they did not have to sit with me. But they saw a woman alone in a booth, and they pulled up a chair. That is more than anyone else in this room did tonight. The diner was completely still. She turned to the shorter man at the counter. She said, you called the police on Christmas Eve because 8 men are eating pie with an old woman. You should be ashamed of yourself. The shorter man looked at the counter. The tall man looked at his boots. Neither of them said anything. Ruby Carver came out from behind the counter. She walked to where the 2 men were standing, and she stopped in front of them. She said, she's right, and I think you boys need to find somewhere else to be tonight. The tall man looked like he wanted to say one more thing. Ruby raised her hand, palm out, one finger pointing at the door. He didn't say it. They left. The bell above the door jingled once and then was quiet. The door swung shut on the cold and the dark. And for a long moment, the room held its breath and then let it go all at once like something released. Vance looked at Eleanor. His wrist was still in her hands. He did not move to take it back. Eleanor released him slowly. She straightened her coat. She picked up her coffee cup. Well, she said, that's enough excitement for one Christmas Eve. Who wants more pie? The room laughed. It was not a polite laugh or a relieved laugh. It was the real kind, the kind that means something has cracked open and the air is getting in. And for a moment, the whole diner felt like the inside of something warm and enclosed and shared. Ruby went back behind the counter and came out carrying a pie in each hand. The family in the far booth sent over a plate of cookies they had brought from home. The men at the counter who had been watching all of this with expressions that had moved from nervousness to relief to something approaching wonder introduced themselves. One of them, a man of about 60 named Preston Gallagher, who came to Ruby's every Christmas Eve because his wife was 3 weeks into a bad recovery from hip surgery and he could not eat another hospital waiting room meal, stood up and walked over to the corner table and held out his hand. Vance shook it. Preston sat down next to Dawson. Within 6 minutes, they were arguing about the Panthers' offensive line and whether this was finally going to be the year something changed, and both of them had opinions, and neither of them was going to back down easily. Eleanor watched it all from the corner of the booth. In the year since Harold died, Eleanor had gotten very good at accounting for time. She knew where every hour went. She knew which parts of the day were manageable and which were not. Mornings were the worst. The house in the morning had a particular quality of light and silence that came in through the kitchen windows and lay across the table and the empty chair and the unwashed cup she had left there the night before because she could not bring herself to wash it yet. She had started leaving the radio on at night so the house had sound when she woke up. She had started sleeping with the light in the hallway on. She had done these things and not told anyone because they were the small confessions of a person in a state she had not chosen and did not know how to explain. But sitting here now in the warm corner of Ruby's roadside with coffee that was actually hot this time, she was aware of something she had not been aware of in a long time. She was not counting the hours. The awareness of that arrived quietly the way the important things usually arrive without announcement. She had been at this table for almost 2 hours, and she had not once thought about what time it was or how much longer she had to sit here before she could reasonably call the evening done. She had been simply here in the way you are simply somewhere when the somewhere is worth being in. Vance refilled his own coffee from the pot Ruby had left at the table. He held up the pot toward Eleanor, and she nodded, and he filled hers too. It was such a small, ordinary thing, the extending of a coffee pot, the receiving of a nod. Harold had filled her cup 10,000 times across 34 years of tables, and she had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the rhythm of breathing. She noticed it now. Silas had gotten quieter after the laughter settled. He was a man who moved in and out of quiet the way weather moves, and Eleanor had begun to read the rhythms of him, the way you read a room you have been in long enough to know its corners. When he was quiet, it was not absence. There was something working in him. Vance had his coffee cup in both hands. He was looking at the table. He said to no one in particular, "She gave me her recipe book when I was 15. Went through it together, page by page, her handwriting everywhere in the margins. Notes about what to add, what to leave out, what she had been told by her mother and her mother's mother." He paused. "I lost it in a move about 8 years ago. A box that didn't make it." Eleanor said, "Do you remember any of it?" He said, "Pieces. The biscuits. Some of the basics." She said, "Then it's not lost. It's in you. The recipes your hands know are different from the recipes in a book." Vance looked at her. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I haven't thought of it that way." She said Harold was a mechanic. 40 years. He used to say that his hands knew things his head never did. He could feel what was wrong with an engine before he found it. He said the knowledge lived in the fingers. She looked down at her own hands on the table. She said, "I suppose I still have that. The parts of him that got into me over 53 years. The way I pour coffee, the way I drive, the things I say without thinking. He's in those. I just have to remember to look." Around the extended table, the conversation began to move again, more quietly now, but more deeply, the way conversations do when something honest has been said and the people in the room have agreed without saying so to meet it at that level. Preston Gallagher was talking to Dawson about his wife's surgery, what it felt like to sit in a waiting room while someone you loved was on the other side of a set of doors you could not go through. Dawson listened. He did not try to fix it. He said, "That sounds like the longest kind of waiting." Preston said, "It is." He said, "We've been married 41 years. He said, I keep thinking I should call her, but it's late and she's supposed to be sleeping, and I don't want to wake her up just because I can't stop thinking about her." Dawson pulled out his phone. He set it on the table and slid it across to Preston. He said, "Call her." Preston looked at the phone. Dawson said, 41 years, call her." Preston picked up the phone. He dialed the number from memory. He turned slightly away from the table, and in a moment Eleanor heard him say low and warm, "Hey, sweetheart, I know it's late. I just wanted to hear your voice." He talked for 10 minutes. When he turned back, his eyes were red at the edges, and he was smiling the small, private smile of a man who has been reminded of something he needed to be reminded of. He handed Dawson's phone back. Dawson put it away without a word. Through the window, Eleanor could see the lot white now under 6 inches of fresh snow, the motorcycles along the front of the building, each wearing a cap of white that made them look like a row of sleeping things. And beyond the lot, coming down off the highway, she could see headlights. Not motorcycles. Something with a light bar across the roof. Vance saw it too. His expression did not change, but his shoulders almost imperceptibly straightened. Silas said low and even, "Sheriff's truck." Then the second one turned in behind it. Two sheriff's vehicles came in off the highway and crossed the lot slowly, their tires compressing the fresh snow, their roof light bars turning, but the lights themselves not on. Active lights meant a response. No lights meant a visit. A visit was worse. A visit meant someone had made a call, and someone had answered it, and whoever had answered it had decided this was worth a personal trip on Christmas Eve. That was not a deputy deciding to check in. That was authority deciding to make a point. Vance did not say anything to the table. He did not need to. Around the extended table, the conversation did not stop, but it changed pitch the way a room changes when the thing that was ambient becomes specific. The vehicles parked side by side in the far end of the lot, nose toward the building. A long moment passed. Then the driver's door of the first truck opened and a man got out. He was not in uniform. He wore a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt and dark jeans and boots that were not department issue. Out of uniform on a call meant deniability, meant personal interest over official function. He was maybe 55 broad through the chest with a gray salted mustache and the walk of a man who had been the most important person in every room he entered for a long time and had no reason to believe tonight was different. His name was Boyd Slater. He was the sheriff of Weston County, and he had been for 11 years, and he had a particular and long memory for Iron Vale MC, the specifics of which went back 5 years to an incident involving a property dispute on the south end of the county that had ended with one of his deputies humiliated and Vance Holden walking away without charges because the law had been on Vance's side, and there was nothing Slater could do about that except remember it. He remembered it. The second truck let out a Deputy Young, maybe 28, who looked like he would have preferred to be somewhere else and was doing his best not to show it. They came inside. Slater stepped in and stopped just inside the door and took in the room with a slow, deliberate look that was about the room taking in him, not about information. Then he moved toward the corner, hands loose at his sides. He stopped short of the table. He looked at Vance. He said, "Holden." Vance looked at him. He said, "Sheriff, Merry Christmas." Slater said, "We got a call about a disturbance." Ruby came out from behind the counter. She said, "There's no disturbance here." Two men came in. One of them said something that needed saying back to him, and they left. Slater looked at Ruby the way he looked at people who had said something he found inconvenient. He said, "I wasn't talking to you, Ruby." Ruby said, "I know you weren't." She did not move. Slater looked back at Vance. He said, "Your club's currently on the watch list, following the Grafton incident." Vance said that matter was closed 18 months ago. Slater said matters have a way of reopening. He was not talking about law. He was talking about the oldest kind of power, the power to make things difficult for someone who had beaten you legitimately in front of people and who you had not forgotten. Vance said, "We're passing through, had a breakdown on the highway, stopped here for food. We've been here 2 hours without incident, which Ruby can tell you and her cameras can confirm." At the word cameras, Slater's eye moved briefly to the ceiling corner where a black dome sat mounted to the bracket. Then it moved back. He said, "I'd like to talk to you outside." Vance said, "With respect, anything you want to say to me, you can say in here." Slater's jaw tightened. He said, "That's not how this works. Outside. Now." There was a long pause. The room had gone the particular kind of still that has nothing to do with sound. Everyone's attention had contracted to the space between Vance Holden and Boyd Slater. Then Eleanor spoke. She said, "Sheriff Slater." Slater turned. Eleanor was sitting in the corner booth, both hands flat on the table, looking at him with the expression of a woman who has earned the right to take up whatever space she requires. She said, "Do you remember Harold Briggs?" Something shifted in Slater's expression. Something complicated because Harold Briggs had been known in Weston County the way men who served and came back changed get known, not as a story, but as a fact. He said, "Yes, ma'am. I remember Harold." Eleanor said he was on the County Veterans Council for 14 years. He ran the Flag Day ceremony at the high school for a decade. He did not ask for recognition. He just showed up and did the work because he believed that was what you did. She said, "He would have been sitting in this booth with me tonight." The room was quiet. She said, "These men are not causing a disturbance. They are having Christmas Eve with me, same as I've had Christmas Eve in this booth for 34 years. And I would like to continue having it without being made to feel like that is a problem, requiring a sheriff to solve on his night off." Slater looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Vance. He looked at the room, the tables pushed together, the coffee cups, the half-eaten pie, the faces turned toward him, all kinds of faces, old and young, biker and civilian, and all of them waiting. He said finally, "You have a good Christmas, Mrs. Briggs." He turned. He walked back to the door. The young deputy followed. The bell jingled. The door closed. A long moment passed. The sound of the first vehicle starting in the lot. Then the second. Then the crunch of tires on snow moving toward the highway. Then quiet. Ruby set both hands on the counter and let out a long breath that she had been keeping contained for the last 8 minutes. She reached into her apron and pulled out her phone. She held it up so the table could see the red recording indicator in the corner of the screen. She said, "I started filming when those 2 men at the counter made the call. I've got everything. Holden being threatened about Grafton. Slater making a personal visit out of uniform. All of it. She said I didn't say anything while he was here because I didn't want him trying to take my phone. But you've got it, all of it." She looked at Vance. She said, "If anything comes back at you later, you call me." Vance looked at her for a moment. He said, "You didn't have to do that." Ruby said, "No, I didn't." She put the phone back in her apron. She said, "Now somebody get the pie. There's a whole other one in back, and I'm not letting it go to waste." The room exhaled. The specific held breath quality that had been sitting in the air since the doorbell had jingled the wrong way released all at once, and the sound came back in the radio and the coffee maker and the clatter from the kitchen, and two of the youngest riders in the back leaned back in their chairs and reached for their cups. The table settled into itself again. But it was a different settling than before the sheriff arrived. Before, the warmth had been building from ease. Now it had the quality of something earned, something that had been tested and held. The men around the table did not talk about what had just happened. They did not need to. They poured more coffee and ate more pie, and the conversations resumed, but they had a depth to them now that comes from having been through something together. It was Dawson who spoke first after the room had found its new level. He said not to anyone specifically. My father was the same way. About police. He said he came back from 2 tours overseas, and every time he saw a badge, his whole posture changed. Not because he'd done anything, just because of what it had meant enough times. He said this to his coffee cup, turning it slowly. Eleanor said, "What happened to him, your father?" Dawson said, "He died when I was 20. Heart. He'd been carrying things a long time in a way that doesn't do the body any favors." He paused. He and Danny were close, more than me and him. They had the same way of finding the funny thing in a situation. I used to be jealous of that. He paused again. Now I'm just glad Danny had it. Eleanor said, "What was your father's name?" Dawson looked up. He said, "Raymond." She said, "Tell me something good about Raymond." He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been asked to do something unexpected in a moment when they were not prepared for it. Then he said, "He made the best pancakes. Not from a mix. He had a recipe from his grandmother that nobody else had because she had not written it down and had told it to him alone when he was 12, standing in her kitchen in the mountains outside Boone. He made them every Sunday morning. He never once measured anything. Just did it from memory. From his hands." Eleanor said, "The things they know in their hands are different from what's on paper. The recipe that matters is the one that lives in someone's body, and when they go, you have to rebuild it from what they left in you. You rebuild it by trying and by remembering and by making it wrong enough times that eventually you make it right." Dawson said, "I haven't tried." She said, "You will, when you're ready." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because you know the difference between the mix and the real thing." That's enough to start with. The night moved deeper. Wallace, who had claimed the stool beside the register, was helping Ruby with the coffee in a way that was more enthusiastic than skilled. He poured things in the wrong order and used too much of everything, but he did it with such genuine pleasure that no one complained. Ruby said later that he had ruined 4 cups and made every person who received one feel like they had been given something. Dawson's phone lit up on the table. He was not there. He had stepped back to talk to 2 of the other riders. But the screen showed a name and Vance saw it. He said quietly to Eleanor, "His mother. She doesn't always know what day it is. She calls when she thinks about him." He paused. "He answers every time, no matter what." Eleanor watched Dawson come back to the table. He picked up the phone. He looked at the name on the screen, and something in his face went through a change that lasted less than a second and was not for anyone else. He answered the call. He walked toward the back of the diner where it was quieter. Eleanor and Vance watched him go. She said he lost his brother. He said yes. She said, and his mother is still with him. He said yes, for now. She doesn't always know who he is when she calls, but she calls, and he answers. Eleanor held her mug. She said, "That's love. Without the certainty, that's the harder kind." Vance said yes. Dawson came back from the back of the diner. He sat down. His phone went face down on the table. He said, "She thought I was Danny tonight." Eleanor said, "Did you tell her?" He said no. She was so happy to talk to him. So I just let her. I said the things I thought he'd say. He looked at the table. I told her about a truck we fixed together when we were teenagers. I told her about the dog. She laughed at the dog story. She said goodbye to Danny at the end. She told him she loved him. Eleanor said, "And what did you say?" He said I told her I loved her too. Nobody at the table said anything for a moment. Eleanor set her hand on top of his on the table. Just briefly. Just enough. She said that was a gift you gave her, and a gift you gave him too, even if he couldn't hear it. Dawson looked at her. He said, "You really think so?" She said, "I think some things do not require the person to be present in order to count." She paused. "I talk to Harold sometimes. In the house when I'm alone. He doesn't answer. But I still tell him things." She said, "You kept the connection open for your mother and for your brother. That counts." Outside, the snow had stopped. Eleanor noticed it without pointing to it, the absence of the sound against the window, the slight shift in the quality of the darkness outside. The snow had stopped, and the sky beyond the lot had that particular post-storm quality, a kind of compressed brightness, as if the clouds were still holding light even though there was nothing visible above them. She said I should go home soon. Vance looked at her. She said, I'm not saying that because I want to. I'm saying it because it's after 10 and the roads are going to be worse the longer I wait, and I'm 82 years old and I don't drive in the dark the way I used to. He said, we'll follow you. She started to say that was not necessary. He said, we'll follow you. She looked at him. She said, you don't need to do that. He said, no, we don't need to. She understood the distinction. She nodded once. Silas had come back to the table. He was standing at the edge of it, coat already on the rubber-banded wallet in his hand. He was looking at it. He said, I'm going to send her something with a horse on it. When we get back, something small. No letter, just let it arrive. Eleanor said, good. He said, and then I'll wait. She said, yes, then you wait. He nodded. He put the wallet back in his jacket. One by one, the table began to stir toward leaving. Wallace had settled the check for the whole table with Ruby, who had argued about the amount and lost. Preston Gallagher shook Vance's hand at the door and said he would be back next Christmas Eve and hoped to see him. Vance said he hoped that too. Ruby came out from behind the counter. She sat down across from Eleanor for a moment the way she had at the beginning of the evening, except now the diner was mostly emptied and the night had been what it had been, and neither of them needed to explain it. Ruby said, you okay? Eleanor said yes. Ruby looked at her. She said, you mean it this time? Eleanor said yes. Ruby said Harold would have loved every single minute of this. Eleanor said he would have talked to every one of them. He would have known all their names and where they were from and what was wrong with their bikes by the end of the night. Ruby smiled. She said, so do you. Know all their names. Eleanor looked at her. She considered this. She said, I suppose I do. Ruby said, he taught you that. Eleanor buttoned the top button of her blue coat. She took her gloves from the table. She looked around the diner one more time, the booths wiped down the counter, cleaned the little plastic Christmas tree on top of the register, blinking its fast, irregular blink. She said, Merry Christmas, Ruby. Ruby said, Merry Christmas, Eleanor. She slid out of the booth for the first time in 4.5 hours. But before she reached the door, Dawson was sitting on a stool at the end of the counter. He was looking at his phone, not at messages, at a photograph. Eleanor slowed as she passed, and she saw what it was. A picture of two boys, maybe 10 and 7 arms around each other, in some backyard somewhere. Both of them grinning the way children grin when they are so happy they cannot contain it in their faces. He said without looking up, that's us, me and Danny. Summer, our parents got us a dog named Sausage. Eleanor stopped. He said, she's a German Shepherd. The name makes no sense. But Danny named her, and nobody was going to tell Danny he was wrong about a dog name. She said, how old is he there? He said 7. She looked at the two boys. She looked at Dawson. She said, he looks like he knew exactly how to be happy. He said he did. He was the best person I ever knew at just being happy in a thing. He locked the phone and put it in his pocket. He stood up. He looked at Eleanor and then looked slightly past her the way you look when you are addressing something larger than one person. He said, thank you for tonight, all of it. He said, I mean that in a way I can't explain right now. She said, you don't have to explain it. She said, go home, get some rest. He said, yes, ma'am. She walked to the door. Vance held it open. The cold came in clean and sharp, carrying the particular smell of stopped snow, that specific absence. That is more than the absence of snow itself, something quiet and reset about it. She stepped out. The lot was white and still. The motorcycles stood in their row. Her truck was in the far corner, snow-covered. Above the lot, the sky had that cold post-storm depth, no stars visible, but the darkness broken up and textured by the clouds moving through it. She scraped her windshield and got in and started the engine. In the mirrors, she could see the motorcycles coming alive behind her headlights, coming on in sequence, exhaust rising in white streams. 23 sets of running lights, 23 engines, 23 men waiting to follow her home. She put the truck in reverse. She took one long breath. She pulled out of the lot. Behind her, 2 by 2, the iron veil followed. The road out of Calverton wound south for 2 miles along the valley floor before climbing the first ridge, and Eleanor drove it the way she had driven it for 41 years, taking the curves at the speed they asked for, and no faster, knowing where the pavement went soft near the creek crossing and where the shoulder dropped away on the far side of the ridge. She knew these 4 miles of road the way she knew the rooms of her house. Behind her, the headlights came in a steady line, close enough to be present, far enough to be respectful. They held their formation through the curves and over the ridge and down the far side, steady and patient, not pushing, not crowding, just following at the pace she set. She could see them in the mirror the whole way. It was not something she expected to feel like something. But what she actually felt was a thing she could not immediately name, something that lived in the chest rather than the head. It was the feeling of not being alone on a road in the dark. It was the simple, enormous, quiet fact of that. She pulled into her driveway at 10:47 and stopped. The house was dark except for the porch light, the small amber fixture beside the front door that she had left on. It lit the step in the door and the wreath of pine boughs she had hung there in November because Harold always put the wreath up the first weekend of November, and she had done it herself this year because she could not let the door be bare. She got out. The bikes had stopped at the end of the driveway, their engines idling low, their headlights still on and pointing toward the house, lighting the way from the truck to the door. She walked up the drive. She reached the step. She took out her keys. She turned. 23 motorcycles at the end of her driveway. Their headlights made a brightness in the dark that was oddly tender, the way a lot of light becomes tender when it is pointed towards something small. The snow on the bike's shoulders, the exhaust rising, the engines quiet at idle. She raised her hand. Vance got off his bike. He walked up the driveway. His boots on the snow were the only sound. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and took out a card, small and white plain. He held it out. She took it. It had a phone number on it, nothing else. He said, "You call that anytime, day or night, Christmas Tuesday, 3 in the morning. Does not matter. Someone will always pick up." She looked at the card. She looked at him. And then Eleanor Briggs, who had not cried since the morning she found Harold on the hallway floor, with one boot on and one boot off, cried. Not much, not a breakdown. Just a few tears that had been waiting since March for the right moment to fall, and this was it, apparently standing on her front step in the cold, with a phone number in her hand and 23 motorcycles at the end of her driveway on Christmas Eve. They came quietly the way things come when they have waited long enough. They rolled down her cheeks and dropped onto the collar of the blue coat. Vance did not look away. He did not try to stop it. He did not say it was going to be all right. He stood in the cold, this large, careful man with the scars on his knuckles and the grief he carried for a mother he had not reached in time. And he let her cry because he understood something about what crying is when it has been held back long enough. It is not falling apart. It is the opposite. It is the body finally trusting the moment enough to let go of what it has been gripping. He just stood there. Eleanor wiped her face with the back of her hand. She took a breath. She straightened. She said, "Thank you, all of you." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He walked back down the driveway. He got on his bike. He started the engine. One by one, the others started theirs. She stood on the step and watched. And then they were moving, pulling away from the end of the driveway, turning back toward the highway, their taillights red and receding, growing smaller as they moved down the road, until the dark and the snow-covered trees and the particular opacity of a rural winter night took them. The sound of the engines faded. Then silence. Eleanor stood on her step. She did not go inside yet. She stood in the cold and let the silence be what it was, the specific silence of after a silence that has a shape to it because of what was there before. She was still holding the card. She looked at it in the light from the porch, the small white rectangle with the handwritten number in black ink. Just a number, a line between one person and another person, the most stripped-down version of "I am here if you need me." Harold had kept a list like that on the inside cover of his address book. Not addresses, just numbers. People who would pick up. He said you didn't need many. You needed enough. You needed to know that if things got bad enough, at 3 in the morning, there was a human voice on the other end of something. She put the card in her coat pocket. She went inside. The house was dark except for the hallway light she had left on. She stood in the entry for a moment with her coat still on and let the house settle around her. It smelled like the pine wreath and like the dish soap she had used that morning, and underneath both of those faintly still, like Harold. Whatever it is that a person's presence leaves in the walls of a house they lived in for 40 years, that specific residual thing that is not scent exactly, but is the closest word she had for it. She did not find it painful tonight. She found it present. She hung the blue coat on the hook by the door, right next to the empty hook where Harold's coat used to hang. She set Vance's card on the kitchen table propped against the sugar bowl so it would be the first thing she saw in the morning. She made herself a cup of tea, not coffee, something that would not keep her awake for hours, and she sat down in her chair at the kitchen table, and she looked at Harold's empty chair, and she looked at the card, and she looked at the window where outside the December dark was as dark as it was going to get. She said to the kitchen Harold, "Something happened tonight." She told him. Quietly, with her tea going warm in her hands, she told him about the booth and the bikers and the boy named Dawson and the card and Slater coming in and the motorcycles in the rear view and the row of taillights disappearing into the dark. She said you would have liked them, every one of them. You would have talked to them all night and asked them about their bikes, and they would have told you, and by the end of the night, you would have known exactly what was wrong with each one. She held her cup. She said, "I'm going to call Sandra in the morning. And Gary, I'm going to tell them both." She said, "I'm all right, Harold, the real way." She finished her tea. She rinsed the cup. She went to the bedroom. She changed into her nightgown. She turned back the covers on her side of the bed. She picked up her phone. She called Sandra. It was 11:45 on Christmas Eve, and Sandra picked up on the third ring, slightly breathless, and said, "Mom, are you okay?" Eleanor said, "Something happened tonight." Sandra said, "What? What happened?" Eleanor said, "Something good. Go sit somewhere comfortable. I want to tell you all of it." She talked for 55 minutes. She told Sandra about Ruby's in the booth and the cold coffee and Vance walking across the room and the way Silas held his daughter's photograph and Dawson on the phone with his mother saying the things his brother would have said. She told her about the two men from the counter and what she had said to them. She told her about Boyd Slater and Ruby's phone and the motorcycles in the rear view all the way up the Ridge Road. She told her about the card. And she told her about crying on the front step, just a little, just enough. Sandra said by the end very quietly, "Mom." Eleanor said, "I know." Sandra said, "I should have been there." Eleanor said, "You're here now." Sandra was crying. She did not try to hide it. Eleanor said, "I want you to hear something. I'm all right. Not the way I've been saying it. Oh, the real way." Sandra said, "I know the difference." Eleanor said, "Yes, you do." They stayed on the phone a while longer, not talking about much, just staying connected through the line, the way you sometimes need to stay on the phone, not because there is more to say, but because the phone call is the thing itself. Eventually, Sandra said she had to go. The kids were up. It was almost 1 in the morning in Seattle, and Christmas was starting with or without her. Eleanor said, "Give them my love." Sandra said, "I will." She said, "I love you, Mom." Eleanor said, "I love you, Sandra." She set the phone down on the nightstand. She lay back against the pillow. She looked at the ceiling of the bedroom she had slept in for 40 years. The water stain in the far corner Harold had been meaning to fix for 3 years. The crack in the plaster near the window where the house had settled after that wet winter in 2008. The ceiling fan that wobbled very slightly when it ran because one of the blades was slightly heavier than the others, which Harold said was actually a feature because it created an irregularity, and irregular things are more interesting. She had not noticed any of this in months. She had been sleeping in this room without seeing it. Tonight she saw it. She turned off the light. The room went to its winter dark, not completely dark, the porch light coming faintly through the curtains and making a thin line on the floor. She lay still and listened to the house, and what she heard was not the awful quiet of a house that has lost the person who made it something, but the ordinary quiet of a house at rest. Wood settling, the heat clicking on, wind in the maple outside the window. Small sounds, house sounds, the sounds of a house that is still standing, still doing what it was built to do, which is to hold against the weather and stay warm. She closed her eyes. She slept. Outside the window, the December dark held the valley and the highway and the hill. The hills, and somewhere out on those hills, the snow lay clean and undisturbed on the pine branches and on the fences and on the roads that wound between the ridges. And the night was very quiet and very cold. And in all of that cold and quiet, a woman slept in her house with a phone card propped against a sugar bowl on her kitchen table, which is a small thing and also not a small thing depending on how you count. The morning came the way December mornings come in western North Carolina, gray first, and then gradually less gray, light arriving without ceremony, just building in the window until there was enough of it to do something with. Eleanor woke at 6:15, which was when she always woke Harold's schedule having become her schedule over so many years, that she could not sleep past it regardless of what the night had held. She lay still for a moment in the gray light. She thought last night happened. This was a thing she did sometimes check the morning after to confirm that things were real. Some of them came apart in the morning, losing their edges in the new light. But last night did not come apart. It was there, all of it, complete and specific. She got up, she put on her robe, she went to the kitchen. The card was there, propped against the sugar bowl. She stood in the kitchen for a moment looking at it. Then she put the kettle on and got Harold's mug from the cabinet, and then her own, and set them both on the counter the way she always did. She left both of them on the counter. She made 2 cups of coffee. She set Harold's in his usual spot on the right side of the table, where the ring of coffee stain was worn into the wood from 30 years of mornings. She sat down in her own chair with her cup and looked at his. She said, "Good morning, Harold." The kitchen was quiet. She said something happened last night, and she told him. The whole of it. Quietly in the gray Christmas morning light, she told him everything she had told Sandra the night before, and then some things she had not told Sandra. The smaller interior things, the way Vance's hand had been rough and warm on top of hers, the specific quality of laughter that came out of her when Silas told the story about the cake and the way 23 sets of taillights had looked in her rear view as they grew smaller on the ridge road. She said, "I'm going to plant your garden in May. The tomatoes. I let it go this year, but I'm going to do it this year. I know how. You showed me enough times." She held her cup. She said, "Merry Christmas." She did not know exactly what she was saying it to. Oh, to the mug, to the kitchen, to the 40 years of mornings that had happened in this room with another person in it, to whatever Harold was or was not now, which she had stopped needing to know because not knowing did not change the fact of him. She said, "Merry Christmas." And then she got up and made herself breakfast, and it was Christmas morning, and outside the snow lay clean on the hills. That was how the first one ended. The months that followed had a different quality than the months before. Not easier exactly, but less sealed. She still had mornings where the empty chair was too much to look at directly. She still had Tuesdays when Sandra's voice on the phone was not enough and was also the only thing she had, and she held onto it with both hands and said she was fine in the real way, now, which was harder to say than the other way, but better. She still drove Harold's truck with the cracked windshield and the wrong compass, and the coffee ring in the cup holder, and she still did not intend to fix any of it. But she had the card now. In July, the second week of it, she had a fall in the kitchen. Not a bad fall, nothing broken, she had put her hand down in time. But she went down on her knee on the tile, and it shook her less the pain than the fact of it, the way the ground had been there when she didn't expect it. She sat on the tile with her back against the cabinet, and then she reached for the card and she called the number. Someone picked up on the second ring. A voice low and unhurried said, "Iron Vale." She said, "This is Eleanor Briggs from Calverton, Christmas Eve." There was a pause, then the voice said, "Mrs. Briggs." "Yes, ma'am. 1 second." There were sounds of movement, and then Vance's voice came on. He said, "Eleanor, you all right?" She said, "I had a fall." She said, "I just needed to tell someone. I don't know why I called you instead of Sandra." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you knew someone would pick up." She said, "Yes, that's it." He said, "You're not hurt." She said, "My knee is sore. My pride is worse." He said, "That'll pass first." She said, "I know." He said, "How are you otherwise?" She said, "I'm all right, the real way." He said, "Good." They talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, about the summer and the road he had ridden that week and a stretch of highway in the mountains he said she would have liked, about whether Ruby's apple or sweet potato was the better pie, on which they disagreed politely and completely. At the end of the call, he said, "We'll be there in December." She said, "I'll be in the booth." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She hung up. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the table and looked out the window at the summer yard, the maple full and green, Harold's garden overgrown, but with tomato plants she had put in herself coming up along the fence. She was all right. That December they came. She was in the booth by 6:30, coffee in hand, coat still on. Ruby had put a small reserve sign in the corner booth. The diner was fuller than the first year because word had gotten around. Families who had not been to Ruby's in years came. A man drove 45 minutes from across the ridge because his daughter had told him the story and he wanted to see if it was true. Ruby had made 4 sweet potato pies. At 8:15, the rumble came through the floor. The headlights swept the ceiling. The door opened and Vance walked in, snow on his shoulders and ice in his beard. He walked across to the corner booth and sat down. He said, "Eleanor." She said, "Vance." He said, "Merry Christmas." She said, Merry Christmas. She said, you came. He said, we said we would. He had brought 21 of them this year. Some of the faces were the same, Silas, large and quiet, taking the chair beside Eleanor without asking, because that was where he sat. Dawson slightly less thinned out than the year before, something in his face that had resettled. Wallace, who laughed easily and often. New faces too, men who had heard about the first Christmas from the ones who were there. Silas reached into his jacket pocket. He placed something on the table. It was a small, painted ceramic figure, an inch and a half tall, a horse bay-colored running. He said, she texted me. Eleanor looked at him. He said, 3 weeks after I sent it. She texted, just one sentence. He said, she said, I always knew you remembered the horses. He said it flat, and even the way he said everything but his voice had the quality of something that had been carried a long way and set down. Eleanor said, and what did you say back? He said, I said always. I said, I remember everything. Eleanor looked at the small horse on the table. She said, good. He said, we've texted 4 times since then. Nothing big. She said she got a B+ on a test. I said I was proud of her. He paused. She didn't say thanks or anything. But she didn't stop texting either. Eleanor said, she's keeping the line open. He said, yeah, that's what I think too. Preston Gallagher came back that second year. He was with his wife, Linda, who was recovered from the hip surgery and walking well. She shook Vance's hand and then sat down next to Eleanor and said, my husband cried telling me about last year. Eleanor said it was a night worth crying about. Linda looked at the room and then back at Eleanor. She said, he said you stood up to Boyd Slater. Eleanor said I had something to say to Boyd Slater. Linda said we all do. Good for you for saying it. They laughed, both of them, the easy laughter of women who have reached the age where they have stopped pretending not to know things they know. Dawson had brought someone that second year. A man named Fletcher, his mother's brother, a broad man of about 50, with a short gray beard who drove 2 hours through the snow from outside Asheville. Dawson had not seen him in 6 years. He had called him in November on an impulse, and Fletcher had said yes. And now here he was at the extended table in his flannel shirt, shaking hands with men in leather vests and eating sweet potato pie and talking to Dawson in the careful way of 2 people covering years of distance, 1 sentence at a time. Dawson introduced Fletcher to Eleanor. Fletcher shook her hand. He said, he told me about last Christmas. He said Dawson doesn't ask for much. Eleanor said, I noticed that. Fletcher said, he asked me to come tonight. Eleanor said, then you were right to come. By 9 o'clock, the corner had expanded to include 3 tables, and the conversations were overlapping and cross-pollinating the way conversations do when people are actually talking to each other rather than performing talking at each other. At 9:45, a different person came through the door. He stood in the entryway for a moment out of uniform in a canvas jacket and dark jeans, and he looked at the room with an expression that was not the one he had worn the year before. Boyd Slater. The room noticed him. Some of the riders had straightened slightly. Silas's expression had gone very flat and still. Vance turned his head. Slater walked to the counter. He did not walk toward the corner table. He sat down on one of the open stools and he looked at the coffee menu on the board above the register. He said to Ruby, coffee, please. Ruby looked at him for a moment. Then she poured a cup and set it in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it. He did not look at the corner table. Wallace, still behind the counter, looked at Ruby. Ruby looked at Wallace. Then Ruby picked up the coffee pot and walked to where Slater was sitting and refilled his cup, even though it did not need refilling. She said, we've got sweet potato pie tonight. Slater looked up. He said, piece of that would be good. Ruby cut him a slice. She set it in front of him. He ate it. He did not say anything for a while. Then he put his fork down. He said Harold Briggs was a good man. Nobody responded immediately. The diner moved around the statement the way it had to. Then Eleanor's voice came from the corner booth, clear and even, and without rancor. She said yes, he was. Slater did not turn around. He nodded once, short and deliberate. He paid for his pie and his coffee, and he put on his jacket, and he left. Nobody said anything about it. After a moment, the conversations resumed. Vance was looking at Eleanor from across the table. She met his eyes. He said quietly, you okay? She said yes. He said that was something. She said it was a man eating pie. She paused. That's all it needs to be. He nodded. She said Harold never needed anyone to say they were sorry. He just needed them to do better. She said I think he'd call that doing better. At 11, Eleanor said she needed to go. Vance stood immediately, and the men around him began the ritual of coats and gloves and leaving. And it was easier this time, more practiced, the way things feel when they are becoming what they are going to be. Ruby hugged Eleanor at the door. Longer than the first year, and both of them knew why, which was that this had become something now, this night, this booth, this particular configuration of people and kindness. And when a thing becomes something, it deserves to be held properly. She went outside, 21 motorcycles in their row running, waiting. She got in the truck and started it. In the rear view, the headlights came on, all 21. She pulled out of the lot, they followed. Same 4 miles over the ridge, the same curves, the same creek crossing. She drove at her own pace, and they held their formation steady and patient in the dark. When she pulled in and got out, Vance walked up the driveway. "I'm sorry, boy." He stood at the foot of the step. He said, "Same time next year." She said, "Same time next year." He reached into his vest. He pulled out a small package wrapped in a paper bag and tied with twine. He held it out. Eleanor took it. She looked at it. He said, "Open it when you're inside." She said, "All right." She said, "Merry Christmas, Vance." He said, "Merry Christmas, Eleanor." She went inside. She hung her coat. She sat at the kitchen table. She opened the package. Inside the paper bag was a small book, thin handbound with a canvas cover and a leather spine. She opened it. On the first page, in handwriting that was precise and deliberate and slightly cramped, were the words, "Helen Holden's recipes. Biscuits." She turned the page. Written out by hand with notes in the margins in a different ink were the ingredients and the steps for a biscuit recipe. The notes in the margins said things like, "Use cold butter always and don't overwork it." And she said this 3 times, so I know it matters. And the last note at the bottom of the page said, "When in doubt, trust your hands." Eleanor ran her finger along the line. "When in doubt, trust your hands." She sat with the little book for a long time. Then she turned to the back. On the last page, in pencil, in small letters, someone had written, "For the woman at the diner who said the recipes that live in your hands aren't lost." Eleanor held the little book. She said to the kitchen herald, "Look at this." She set the book against the sugar bowl next to the card. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table on Christmas night and felt the fullness of it, the unexpected fullness of a life that goes on past the point where you expected to be lonely, that finds past the point of expecting the small and enormous fact of being known by people you did not know a year ago. She thought about what she would make first. The biscuits, she decided. Start with the biscuits. In the years that followed, the tradition held. Every Christmas Eve, the booth was reserved. Every Christmas Eve, Eleanor came at 6:30. Every Christmas Eve, somewhere around 8, the floor began to hum, with something coming from the highway, and the headlights swept across the ceiling, and the door opened. The diner filled more every year. It became a thing people planned for. Ruby started taking down the booths on one side in November to make room for the extra tables she would need. She started putting a sign in the window after Thanksgiving, just a hand-lettered one. "Christmas Eve dinner. Everyone welcome." That was all it said. That was enough. People came from other counties. A reporter from the Asheville paper called Ruby in year 3 and asked if he could write about it. Ruby said he could come and eat pea, and if something happened worth writing about, he could write about it. He came, he ate, he wrote something that he said afterward was one of the better things he had done in 20 years at the paper. The piece ran on Christmas morning. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table with Harold's mug in its spot on the right side, and the little recipe book propped against the sugar bowl, and the card from Vance worn completely soft, now handled so many times it had the texture of old cloth. She read it through. Then she set it on the table and said, "Harold." Someone wrote it down. Silas saw his daughter in May of year 3. She had called him in April, which he had not expected, and said she was going to be near Asheville for a weekend and asked if he wanted to meet for coffee. He said yes before he finished understanding what she had asked. They met at a diner in Swannanoa. They sat for 2 hours. He showed her photographs on his phone. She showed him photographs on hers. At the end, she said, "I'm not ready to call this fixed." He said, "I'm not asking you to call it anything." She nodded. She hugged him at the door. Silas stood on the sidewalk after she drove away and did not move for a full 3 minutes. He told Eleanor about it the following Christmas Eve. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "You did that. You and the horse and the patience." He said, "And the thing you told me about the letters." She said, "I told you something you already knew. You just needed to hear it outside your own head." He said, "Yeah." He said, "That's what you do." She said, "What do I do?" He said, "You say true things outside people's heads." She held her coffee cup. She said, "Harold used to say I was direct." Silas said, "That's a kind way to put it." She laughed. Silas went to Kayla's college graduation in May of year 5. She had called him in April and asked him. He drove to Raleigh in a rented car because he did not want to show up to his daughter's graduation on a motorcycle, which was a decision that cost him a significant amount of personal dignity, but which Kayla, when she saw him in the crowd in his button-down shirt and clean jeans, texted him about immediately. "Dad, you wore a shirt." He texted back, "Special occasion." She texted, "You look good." He stood in the bleachers and watched his daughter walk across the stage in a blue gown and accept a piece of paper, and he took 17 photographs, and none of them were very good because his hands were not entirely steady. He told Eleanor about it that Christmas. He said, "I thought about you when she crossed the stage. I thought Mrs. Briggs would like this." Dawson brought his Uncle Fletcher every year after the first. Fletcher drove the 2 hours in the snow every time. After year 2, he brought his wife, and after year 3, his daughter, and by year 4, the Fletcher family had become a fixture at the extended table. Dawson called his mother every week. She did not always know who he was. When she passed in March of year 4, Dawson was there. He had taken the week before off and driven to Hendersonville and sat with her every day and been there when it happened. He called Vance from the parking lot of the facility afterward, which was the right call to make, and Vance drove 3 hours that same afternoon. They did not do anything in particular. They drove around for 2 hours and stopped for food and drove back. But Vance came, which was the point. At Christmas that year, Eleanor watched Dawson across the extended table and saw in his face the specific quality that grief leaves in people who have done the work of carrying it properly, something worn in rather than worn down, something that has settled into who the person is rather than sitting on top of them. She thought, he is going to be all right. He already was. Vance came every year until the year he turned 60, and then he kept coming anyway because the alternative was not coming, which he had considered briefly and dismissed. The first Christmas after Eleanor's eventual passing, the tradition changed shape without changing substance. The booth was still reserved. Ruby still made 4 pies. The riders still came through the door at 8:15 with snow on their shoulders. But the center of it was different now. The center of it was absence, which is itself a kind of presence when the absence has been loved enough. Eleanor Briggs passed away on a Wednesday morning in April, 5 years after that first Christmas Eve. She was 87 years old. She was in the kitchen when it happened, which was where she spent most of her mornings with coffee and Harold's mug in its spot and the little recipe book and Vance's card worn completely soft, now propped against the sugar bowl. Sandra flew in from Seattle that afternoon. Gary drove from Charlotte, where he had moved 2 years before to be closer. They sat in the kitchen together on the first night and did not say much, just sat in the room where their mother had sat for 41 years and let it be what it was. On the counter was a small printed note on a piece of paper in Eleanor's handwriting, placed where it would be seen. It said, "The card by the sugar bowl. Call it. Tell them." Sandra called the number the next morning. Someone picked up on the second ring. She said, "My name is Sandra. Eleanor Briggs was my mother." There was a pause. Then a voice low and familiar to her from every story Eleanor had told said, "We know who you are. Your mother talked about you all the time." At the funeral held on a Saturday at the church where Eleanor and Harold had sat in the same pew for 31 years, 21 motorcycles were parked in the lot along the side of the building. The riders sat in the back 3 rows of the church. They wore their vests. They sat with their hands in their laps and their backs straight, and they did not apologize for being there. Fletcher was there in his flannel shirt and clean jeans with his wife and daughter. Preston Gallagher was there with Linda beside him, her hand through his arm. Dawson sat in the row behind Silas. Wallace sat at the end of the pew, the same easy presence he carried everywhere. Ruby Carver sat 3 rows from the front with her hands folded in her lap and her chin up. When the service ended and people moved toward the door, the riders came forward one by one or in small groups and spoke to Sandra and Gary, saying things about their mother, that her children had not known the specific and accumulated knowledge of people who had sat across a table from her for 5 Christmas Eves and heard her say true things outside their heads. Silas shook Sandra's hand. He said, "She told me how to reach my daughter." He said, "I just wanted you to know that." Dawson said, "She told me grief doesn't have a schedule." He said she was right about that the way she was right about most things. Last of all, Vance. He stood in front of the casket for a long moment. He reached into his vest. He brought out a small ceramic horse, bay-colored, running an inch and a half tall. He set it on the lid of the casket. He turned and shook Sandra's hand. He said she called me once in July, the summer after that first Christmas. She'd had a fall. He said she called me instead of you because she knew someone would pick up. Sandra said, she told me about that call. He said she was all right. She said it the real way. He walked back to the door. Outside, the riders mounted their bikes. The engines started in sequence, one after another, a low rumbling conversation. They rode out of the church lot slowly 2 by 2 and moved down the road past the diner with its sign in the window and past the hardware store and out of Calverton and onto the highway that headed north. Sandra found the recipe book on her second day in the house on the kitchen counter next to the card. She read through it slowly, the handwriting she did not recognize, the margin notes, the last line on the final page. She held it for a long time. She put it in her bag to take back to Seattle. That December, she made the biscuits. They were not right the first time. The second time, they were closer. The third time, her youngest daughter, who was 11, came into the kitchen while she was making them and asked if she could help, and Sandra said yes, and they made them together. And Sandra told her daughter about Eleanor and about the diner and the bikers and the 5 Christmas Eves and the little book. Her daughter listened to all of it. She said, "Is that a true story?" Sandra said every word. Her daughter said, "Can we go to that diner sometime?" Sandra said, "We can." They went the following Christmas Eve. They drove up from Charlotte, Sandra and her husband and both children, and they pulled into the lot of Ruby's roadside at 7 in the evening and went inside, and Ruby was behind the counter and looked up when the bell jingled, and she saw Sandra, and she set down what she was holding and came out from behind the counter and held Sandra for a long time without saying anything. Eleanor's booth had a small wooden plaque on the wall above it now, just a name and 2 dates. And below the dates, in the same kind of handwriting that had been in the recipe book, 4 words. No one sits alone. Not ever. Sandra and her family sat in that booth. Ruby brought pie. At 8:15, the floor began to hum with something coming from the highway, and the headlights swept the ceiling, and the door opened. And in the corner booth in the warmth, there was room. The first Christmas without Eleanor was the hardest in the way that first instances of anything always are, because a first time is also a proof, a demonstration, that the thing is continuing without the person it was built around. They sat in her booth, and the conversation was quieter than it had been, and the pie tasted the same but meant something different. Sandra was there, and she told whoever wanted to hear about the night 5 years before the whole story. And the people who had been there said, yes, that's right. And the people who had only heard it said they wished they had been there. And Sandra said, you can still be here. She said that's what she would tell you. Come, sit, there's always room. Sandra's daughter, 12 years old now, sat next to Silas. She was not afraid of a large man in a leather vest because she had grown up hearing the story, and Silas in the story was not someone to fear. He was the man who sent a horse and waited. She said, did Kayla ever text back again after the first time? Silas said, we text every week now. He said she's going to college in the fall. Veterinary medicine. He paused. She wants to work with horses. The girl said, did you go to her graduation? Silas said, she asked me to. The girl said, then you should go. He said, yeah. He said, I know. He went. He stood in the bleachers in his button-down shirt and watched his daughter walk across the stage in a blue gown, and he took 17 photographs, and none of them were very good because his hands were not entirely steady, which was information he kept to himself. Wallace near the counter was helping Ruby with the coffee the same way he always had, which was to say enthusiastically and with mixed results. Ruby said later that he had ruined 3 cups and made every person who received one feel like they had been given something. Some things, she said, do not improve with practice and do not need to. After a while, Silas spoke to the empty chair at the corner of the table, the one that had always been Eleanor's, the one that was still left open because no one had been quite able to bring themselves to fill it. He said, I think about her when Kayla texts me. Dawson across the table said, I think about her when my mom called. Vance said, I think about her on Sundays around 6. Ruby, standing near the counter, I think about her every time someone sits alone in that booth. There was a quiet at the table that had the quality of tribute, the kind of quiet that is not uncomfortable, but is the proper weight of a thing. Wallace said she would hate all this sentiment. Silas said, she would say she was just in her booth. Ruby said, and mean it. The table was quiet another moment, and then someone began talking about something else. And the night moved on, and more coffee was poured, and the pie was eaten, and eventually the engine started in the lot, and the lights swept the ceiling, and the door opened on December cold. And the story continued in the way all the best stories continue, not by ending, but by becoming something that doesn't need to. The plaque above Eleanor's booth was still there in year 10 and in year 15, and past that, and the people who came to Ruby's roadside and asked about it were told the story, all of it, by whoever was available to tell. It Ruby, or a regular, or one of the young waitstaff who had only heard the story themselves but had heard it enough times to know every part. They told it the way you tell things that matter, starting at the beginning, which was a woman alone in a corner booth with cold coffee on Christmas Eve, and moving through to the part that was not an ending at all, the part where the door opens every December and the floor hums with something coming from the highway, and there is room in the corner booth. There is always room. Not because it is a large booth. It is not a large booth. It fits 4 people comfortably and 6 people if everyone agrees to be close. But it has held over the years a number much larger than that, mechanics and veterans and a sheriff who one December ordered pie and did not say he was sorry, but said something better. The thing that comes after sorry, the thing that looks like doing better. It has held an old woman's grief and a daughter's photographs and a young man's voice saying his brother's name on the phone. It has held laughter that came from somewhere deep and needed somewhere to go. It has held the particular warmth of strangers who discovered in the space of one Christmas Eve that the word stranger is mostly a temporary condition. That is the whole story. Or rather, that is the start of it. The real story is the one that keeps happening every December in that booth in Calverton, North Carolina. The one you would have to be there to see. The one that requires the smell of coffee and the sound of engines and the specific warmth of a room that is full of people who have stopped being strangers for one night, which is sometimes enough. That one does not have an ending. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Which is exactly as it should be. There is something particular about the way a diner sounds in late December. It is a sound built from layers from the coffee maker cycling and the radio turned low and forks on ceramic plates and the murmur of conversation across booths, all of it blending into a kind of textured warmth that is less noise than atmosphere. You stop hearing it the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. It becomes the condition rather than the content. Eleanor had been inside that condition for 3 hours and had stopped thinking about it, which is how you know a place has taken you in. She was watching Wallace, who had migrated behind the counter somewhere in the last hour and was attempting to pour coffee with the enthusiasm of a man who has never poured coffee professionally but sees no reason why that should stop him. He held the pot with both hands and tilted it with the care of someone transporting something precious and slightly volatile. The result was uneven, too much in some cups and not enough in others. But he apologized for each overpour with such genuine good humor that the recipients seemed to enjoy the apology more than they would have enjoyed a better poured cup. Ruby watched him from the far end of the counter with an expression she wore when she had decided that a situation was beyond control and that the best response was to allow it to proceed to its natural conclusion. She said to no one in particular, "I'm going to need a full pot when this is over." Wallace said, "I'm getting better." Ruby said, "You're not getting better, but you're enthusiastic, and that counts for something at Christmas." Eleanor heard this exchange and felt somewhere in her chest the specific lightness that comes from being in a room where things are going fine in a slightly chaotic way, which is the best way for things to go when you have not expected them to go any particular way at all. Vance had been quiet for a few minutes. He had poured himself a fresh cup from the pot Wallace had abandoned, and he was sitting back in his chair, it not far from Eleanor, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm if she had wanted to. He was looking at the middle distance the way he did when he was working something out. She said, "What are you thinking about?" He said, "October." She said, "What about October?" He said, "She died on a Thursday in October and I was on the road and I didn't make it back." He said, "Every October, I think I should have been somewhere else." He paused. "I don't know how to stop thinking that." Eleanor said, "You probably can't stop thinking it." He looked at her. She said, "Some things don't stop. They just become part of how you move through time. Like a limp. Harold had a limp for 47 years. It didn't go away. He just learned every road with it. Vance was quiet. She said, the thought that you should have been somewhere else. That's going to be with you, but it doesn't have to be the loudest thing. Sometimes it's just there and you're also there and the road is also there and you keep going. He said, that's a hard way to put it. She said, most true things are. He looked at her across the table and in his expression was something that had come a long way to be there. Something that had been compressed by years of roads and motels and the specific masculine discipline of not showing what costs you. And that had found tonight in a corner booth of a diner in Western North Carolina, enough room to relax slightly. Just slightly, but enough. He said, my mother used to say that nobody earns their grief. She said, you don't do anything right or wrong to get it. It just lands. Eleanor said she sounds like she was a wise woman. He said she was stubborn. I thought they were the same thing for a long time. He almost smiled. Maybe they are. Eleanor said Harold was stubborn too. He held opinions about things that did not require opinions, roads and weather, and the correct way to stack firewood. He had a position on all of it. She said I used to argue with him about the firewood stacking, and then one winter I stacked it his way, and it burned better, and I have never once admitted that to anyone. Vance laughed. A real one, low and short, but real. Eleanor said, don't tell anyone. He said, who would I tell? She said, you'd be surprised. Word gets around. The diner had changed in some way she could not precisely name since the two men had left and Slater had come and gone. The change was not about who was here and who was not. It was something in the quality of the air, a thickness to the warmth, the way a room feels when it has been through something and held, and is now on the other side of it. The conversations were not quieter, but they were more honest somehow. The way conversations get when people have been reminded of what they are actually trying to do, which is be present with each other for as long as the night allows. Garner, who had been largely quiet all evening, said something low to the man beside him, and the man beside him laughed, and that laugh moved around the table the way laughter does when it has been waiting for an opening. Eleanor said, your man there, Garner, he doesn't say much. Vance said he says exactly what needs to be said, never more. Eleanor said Harold was like that in the beginning. When we were young, he would go whole evenings without saying more than 20 words. I thought he was mysterious. She paused. Later I understood he was just watching. He watched everything. He stored it up. And then sometimes late at night he would say one thing that was worth more than everything anyone else had said all day. Vance had said, what kind of thing? Eleanor thought for a moment. She said once we'd had a hard year. The children were small, money was tight. There'd been a health scare with my mother. We were sitting on the porch one evening and I was feeling the weight of all of it and not saying so because that was how I was then keeping it inside. And Harold just said out of nowhere, we're going to be all right because we're still choosing each other every day. He said, that's not nothing. That's everything, actually. She paused. He said that and then he picked up his glass and didn't say anything else for half an hour. Vance was looking at the table. She said, I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I thought it was just something nice to say. She said, I understand now. Every day you choose. Even on the bad days, especially on the bad days, you choose again. And that choosing is what makes it mean something. She paused. I think that's what I miss most. Having someone to choose every day. She said, you get so used to it. The daily choosing. And then one morning you get up and there's no one to choose and you don't know what to do with the habit. Vance looked at her. He said, is there anything that helps? She said this. She said it without hesitation. This helps. Sitting somewhere with people who are saying true things. It doesn't fix anything, but it helps. He said, yeah. He said, I know what you mean. Outside, the snow had stopped by this point, and the sky had that particular quality of a sky that has finished what it was doing and is resting. The lot beyond the window was white and still. The motorcycles in their row, each one carrying its cap of accumulated snow, sat the way machines sit when they have been given something to do and have done it and are waiting for the next instruction. Eleanor looked at them through the window. She said, how long have you been riding? He said, since I was 19, 30 years then. She said Harold had an Indian motorcycle when we met. He sold it when Sandra was born. He said it was the responsible thing to do. He paused. He said it every spring for about 15 years. She said, I think he thought about it his whole life. Vance said a man doesn't stop thinking about his first motorcycle. She said, is that a rule? He said, it might as well be. She said I should have told him to get another one when the children were grown. She said I didn't think to. I thought what he had was enough. She paused. Maybe it was, but I could have said, go get a motorcycle, Harold, just to see his face. She looked at the window again. She said small regrets are the saddest ones. The big ones have enough weight to carry themselves, but the small ones just sit there and tap you on the shoulder. Vance said the motorcycle. She said the motorcycle. In the cornbread recipe, in about 30 years of not saying out loud what I was thinking on any given evening because I thought there would be time, she said there is always time until there isn't. He said yes. She said, so say the things. He looked at her. She said, that's the lesson. If you want one, say the things while there's still someone there to hear them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I keep her number in my phone. She said, yes, you told me. He said, I talk to it sometimes. He said this to the table, not quite to her, and she understood it was not exactly a confession as much as it was a thing he was permitting himself to say out loud for what might have been the first time. He said, I don't say anything out loud. I just dial and let it ring, and I listen to the recording of her voice on the voicemail greeting. She says her name and to leave a message. She says it like she's in a hurry, like she has somewhere to be, which she always did. He paused. I just listened to that and hang up. Eleanor said, that's not crazy. He said, I know it's not crazy. It just feels like something I shouldn't need. She said, there's no shouldn't about grief. There is only what you need and what you do. She said, keep the number. He said, I wasn't planning to delete it. She said, good. They sat for a while without talking, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that means the people on either side of it have said enough for now and do not need to fill it with anything. Ruby came by and refilled both cups without being asked. She looked at them both, Eleanor and Vance, and then she looked at the room, the tables full. The conversations layered the specific warmth of a space that is being used well, and something moved across her face that was not quite pride but was in that neighborhood the expression of a person who has made something and is watching it be more than they made. She went back behind the counter without saying anything. Eleanor looked at the room as Ruby had looked at it, but from the corner where she had been sitting since 6 o'clock. She looked at all of them, the men in leather, and the regulars, and the families who had stayed, and the strangers who had come in, when the word had moved around that something was happening at Ruby's tonight, and had decided they wanted to be part of it. She looked at Silas, large and quiet, his wallet with the rubber bands sitting on the table in front of him now. Open to the photograph that he touched every few minutes the way you touch something you need to confirm is still there. She looked at Dawson, who had his phone in his hand and was not on a call, but was looking at something on the screen with the still private expression of someone who is in two places at once. She looked at Preston, who was talking to the man beside him, with the animation of someone who has been given permission to talk, and she thought of him earlier, saying his wife's name into Dawson's phone in the quiet corner of his voice, and what that had cost him to do and what it had given him. She thought this is what we are supposed to do for each other, not the grand gestures, not the organized kindness, the charity and the check writing and the correctly scheduled grief support. The small and specific gestures, pulling up a chair, pouring a cup, sliding a phone across a table and saying, call her, 41 years, call her, holding a hand above the table without trying to fix what the hand is holding. This is what we are supposed to do, and we mostly don't, because we are busy or embarrassed, or we assume someone else is doing it, or we tell ourselves the person doesn't need it. She said she was fine. She seems all right. She'd say something if she needed something. She had said she was fine. She had needed something. And 23 men who had no reason to stop had stopped anyway. And a woman with gray hair in a diner had put a hand on a shoulder and said, you call me if you need anything, and meant it. And between all of them, they had undone 9 months of a particular kind of alone. She looked at Vance. He was watching the room too. And for a moment, they were both doing the same thing, looking at what the evening had become. And they did not say anything to each other about it, because there was not much to say. Sometimes the right response to something is to just witness it properly. She said, eventually, I meant to ask you something. He said, ask. She said, when you walked across the diner, when you first came in, you walked straight to me. You didn't go to the counter. You didn't look for a table. You just walked over. Why? He looked at her. He said, because you were the most alone person in the room. He said, not sad alone, not lonely alone. He paused, looking for it. He said alone the way a person is alone when they've been carrying something so long by themselves that they've forgotten there's another way. He said, my mother looked like that the last time I saw her before the facility. Eleanor said, and you didn't make it back? He said, no. She said, so you made it here instead. He was very still for a moment. He said, I hadn't thought of it that way. She said, it doesn't undo what happened, but it counts. The things we do for other people's mothers count even when we can't do them for our own. He said, yeah. He said it quietly, yeah. The room moved around them. Wallace was telling someone a story that required large gestures and that Garner was listening to with the specific expression of a man who has heard the story many times and enjoys watching other people hear it for the first time. Two women near the middle table were sharing something on a phone, both of them leaning in, both of them starting to smile. Preston had fallen into a long conversation with Ruby's granddaughter about something involving local history that neither of them seemed to know very well, but that both were enjoying speculating about. Dawson had his phone in his hand again, and this time Eleanor could see from where she sat that he was composing something, a text maybe, or the beginning of a letter to someone, and his face had the particular concentration of someone who is choosing words with care. She hoped it was to Fletcher. She thought it might be. She hoped it was. The night had moved a long way from where it started. Eleanor thought of the parking lot at 6 o'clock Harold's truck. In the corner, the 8 cars she had counted before she went in the snow on the windshield she would have to scrape. She thought of the bell above the door and Ruby setting down the coffee pot to look at her with that expression that had no word for it. Somewhere between concern and love, in the particular weariness of a woman who has seen people in pain for 60 years and has not looked away once. She thought of Harold in this booth, his hand under the table on her hand, the way he used to do it quietly so as not to make a thing of it, as if the gesture were private, even when people could see them, as if what passed between them in the touching was something that did not require an audience to be real. It had always been real. All 34 of those Christmas Eves, it had been real, and real things do not become less real when the person is no longer there to be real with. They persist in a different form, not present but not gone, not held but not lost. Something in between. Something that lives in the way you pour coffee and the way you drive a truck and the way you know without thinking which curves of a familiar road ask for which speed. Harold was in all of that. He always would be. She unwrapped her hands from the mug. She straightened her coat. She looked at the room one more time. She said to Vance, I think I'm ready to go home. He said, we'll follow you. She said, I know you will. She slid to the edge of the booth. She stood up. And the evening moved toward its close the way good evenings do not, ending exactly, but completing the way a piece of music completes, rather than stops finding its last note and letting it linger in the air just long enough. The second Christmas was different from the first, the way a second reading of a book is different from the first. You already know where things go. You have less anxiety about the shape of it and more attention for the parts you missed the first time. Eleanor arrived at 6:30 again. Ruby had the corner booth reserved and the coffee waiting and the sign in the window, and when Eleanor came through the door, Ruby looked up and said, same booth, same pie, same argument about whether the apple or sweet potato is better. Eleanor said sweet potato. Ruby said, I know what you're going to say, Eleanor. Eleanor said, then why do we keep having the argument? Ruby said, because you enjoy being right and I enjoy telling you you're wrong. Eleanor sat down. The diner was already fuller than the first year. Word had gone out through the particular channels that small-town word goes through, and people had decided they wanted to be part of whatever this was. She recognized some of the faces. The family from the middle booth who had sent over cookies the previous year, the mother now visibly pregnant. A pair of older men from the hardware store she had seen in here before but never spoken to. Both of them settled in at the counter with coffee and the easy posture of men who have a regular place and know it. She did not recognize the others, but they were there, which was the point. At 8:15, the floor hummed, and Vance walked through the door. He stopped just inside and then looked around the room, and when his eyes found Eleanor in the corner booth, they held for a moment, and then something in his face shifted in the small and specific way of a person who has returned somewhere they were not sure they would be able to return to and are relieved to find it still exists. He crossed the diner. He sat down. He said, you're here. She said, of course I'm here. She said, you said same time next year. He said, I did. She said Harold kept his word about everything. I learned from the best. Silas came in behind him and took the chair to Eleanor's left without asking as before because that was where Silas sat. He was carrying something in his jacket pocket that made a slight bulk on the left side, and before he even got settled, he reached in and brought out the small ceramic horse and set it on the table between them. He said, "She texted me." And Eleanor listened to all of it, the first text, and then the text that followed, and when he was done, she said, "Good." And when he said he had written back and she had not stopped texting, she said, "She's keeping the line open." And she meant it the way she always meant the things she said without embellishment, as a fact that was also a reassurance. Silas picked up the small horse and turned it in his hands. It was a good casting. The muscles of the haunches defined the head slightly down, as if the horse were choosing its footing. He set it back on the table. He said, "I'm going to keep coming back here." Eleanor said, "Good." He said, "As long as you're here." Eleanor said, "Then I'll stay as long as you're coming." He nodded. He reached for his coffee. The second Christmas Eve had the quality of an established thing, which is a different quality from a new thing. New things have a brightness to them, an alertness, the heightened awareness of people experiencing something for the first time and trying to take all of it in. Established things have a different texture, deeper and more comfortable. The way a chair you have sat in many times feels different from a chair you are sitting in for the first time. You can relax into it. You know where the arms are. Eleanor could relax into it. She could sit with her coffee and watch the room with the ease of a person who knows she belongs here and does not need to prove it or explain it or justify it to anyone, including herself. She could let the evening move at whatever pace it wanted to move at, and she could trust that the people around her would meet the pace and that the night would be what it was going to be, which was this warm and full and somewhat too loud and exactly right. Dawson had brought his Uncle Fletcher this year, and Fletcher had come 2 hours in the snow because Dawson had asked, and Fletcher understood that being asked by someone who doesn't ask for much is itself a kind of honor. Fletcher was a quiet man with a firm handshake and good manners, and the kind of face that has spent a lot of time outdoors and developed an honesty from it. He shook Eleanor's hand and said Dawson had told him about last Christmas, and he said he was glad to be here. Eleanor said, "Where are you from?" Fletcher said, "Outside Asheville, born and raised." He said, "I've been on this ridge my whole life." He said, "Sometimes I think I don't know enough of the world." Eleanor said, "The world has a way of coming to you if you leave the door open." He looked at her. She said, "Case in point." Fletcher laughed. It was a good laugh, unhurried, the laugh of a man who doesn't perform laughter but lets it happen when it's earned. He said, "I suppose that's true." Eleanor said, "Your nephew is a good young man." Fletcher said, "He is. He said he didn't always have it easy." Eleanor said, "Easy is overrated." She said, "Harold used to say that the people who had it easy never developed the second set of eyes, the ones that see what the easy people can't see." Fletcher said, "Second set of eyes." She said, "The ones that see pain in other people because they know what it looks like from the inside." She said, "Dawson has those eyes." She said, "That's worth more than easy." He said, "I'll tell him that." Eleanor said, "You can tell him from me." He said, "I will." The evening deepened around them. Ruby moved between tables as she always moved, carrying things and saying things and being exactly what the room needed her to be, which was the person who held it all together. The radio was on, but low enough to be atmosphere rather than interference. The snow was falling outside, lighter than the previous year, but falling, and the windows had the specific quality of windows in winter, when it's warm inside and cold out, fog slightly at the corners, the outside world looking soft and removed. Eleanor looked at all of it and felt, as she had felt the previous year, the particular full feeling of a life that is still going somewhere, even when you have stopped expecting it to. At 83 years old, she had expected that the going somewhere had mostly been done. She had expected the maintenance of things, the careful management of what remained, the gradual and dignified narrowing that people call settling. She had not expected a room full of people who kept coming back. She had not expected to be the center of anything. She was not comfortable being the center of anything. She was a corner booth person, which is a different thing from a center of the room person, and she had been one for 83 years and was not about to change. But she had accepted somewhere between the first Christmas and this one that the corner booth could be the center if enough people pulled their chairs up to it. Harold would have found this enormously funny. She could hear his laugh already, the specific quality of it when something surprised him, when the world turned out to be more than he had expected it to be. It was not a big laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes from a place of genuine delight from someone who is still capable of being delighted at 81 years old, which not everyone manages to stay. She thought I should try to stay capable of being delighted. She thought tonight is a good start. At some point late in the evening, Vance moved to sit beside her rather than across from her. Not for any particular reason that was said. He had been talking to someone across the room, and when he came back, the seat beside her was open, and he took it, and from there they both looked out at the diner together rather than at each other, which was a different kind of conversation, the side-by-side kind. The kind you have with someone when you have said enough face-to-face things and now you just want to look at the same thing together. He said after a while, "This is a good thing." She said yes. He said it wasn't supposed to be a thing at all, just a stop. She said the best things are never supposed to be. He said my mother would have called this a blessed accident. Eleanor said, "She sounds like she was right about most things." He said she was. He said it without any irony. She was right about most things. She was wrong about the biscuit recipe because she said it wasn't hard. And it is, but about most things, yes. Eleanor laughed. He said, "We'll come back." She said, "I know." He said, "Every year, as long as you're in this booth." She said, "Then I'll keep being in this booth." He said, "Yes, ma'am." They sat quietly together and looked at the room. And the room looked back at them in the way rooms do when something in them has become permanent. When what was once an event has become a tradition, when the thing that happened once and could have been only once has decided it wants to keep happening. It kept happening. Year after year, the booth was reserved. Year after year, the floor hummed at 8:15, and the headlights swept the ceiling, and the door opened, and Vance walked in and crossed the room and sat down and said her name, and she said his, and the evening began. And it kept being what it was on the first night, which was this warm and honest and somewhat improbable, full of people who had no particular reason to be in the same room, except that one of them had been alone in a corner booth, and one of them had seen it and sat down, and everything else had followed from that, the way all the best things follow from the simplest gestures, the way a river follows from a single place where the ground gives way to water. Eleanor stayed in the booth until she could not stay anymore. She stayed until 87, which is a good long time, and she stayed all the way through, never once going back to sitting alone on Christmas Eve, never once saying she was fine when she wasn't, never once letting the card go back to being just a piece of paper rather than a line between herself and someone who would pick up. On the morning she died, there was coffee on the table, and the little recipe book propped against the sugar bowl, and the card from Vance, worn completely soft now, and Harold's mug in its spot on the right side of the table, where it had been every morning for 41 years, because Eleanor had kept putting it there every morning and intended to keep doing so for as long as she had mornings. That is a small thing. That is also not a small thing. The distinction between those two, small and not small, is one that Eleanor understood by the end better than she had at the beginning. A card with a phone number on it is a small thing. A mug in a spot on a table is a small thing. A ceramic horse an inch and a half tall is a small thing. A woman sitting alone in a corner booth with cold coffee is a small thing, or looks like one from the outside. From the inside, it is an entire life. From across a diner, it is something worth walking toward. And from the end of a driveway on Christmas Eve with 23 motorcycles idling in the dark and the taillights ready to be lit, and the road home covered in snow that will hold the tracks of whatever passes over it until morning, it is everything. It is absolutely everything. The plaque above the corner booth reads her name and 2 dates, and below them 4 words. And those 4 words are the whole lesson of the whole thing, the thing Eleanor knew before she went to the diner that first December and discovered she did not know yet how to live, and that she learned at a table surrounded by men in leather vests, eating sweet potato pie on Christmas Eve, and that she carried forward into every year that followed, and that she left behind when she went. No one sits alone. Not ever. Not if someone is paying attention. Not if someone will walk across a room. Not if the door opens and there is a booth in the corner and a woman who has been alone since 6 o'clock and whose coffee has gone cold twice and who says when you sit across from her without asking permission, "Well, then I suppose you'd better sit because I've been alone since 6 o'clock and this coffee's gone cold twice already." That is where it begins. The rest follows. There is a thing that happens in rooms like Ruby's roadside on nights like Christmas Eve, a thing that does not have an official name, but that everyone who has been in a room where it happened recognizes afterward. It is the thing that happens when people stop managing each other and start being present with each other, when the performance of a holiday, The cards, in the coordinated schedules, in the choreographed warmth, gives way to something unscripted and uncoordinated and therefore more real. It cannot be organized. It cannot be planned. It requires only the right configuration of people in a place with enough room and someone willing to pull up a chair. Eleanor Briggs pulled up her chair 34 Christmas Eves in a row, always the same booth, always with Harold, always with coffee and tea and the conversation that did not need to get anywhere to be worth having. After Harold died, she pulled up the same chair in the same booth by herself because the chair still needed pulling up even when the other person was gone. She did not know that anyone would join her. She did not ask anyone to. She just showed up because showing up was the thing she knew how to do. The rest followed from that. Everything good always follows from showing up. Vance Holden showed up because he could not drive past a woman sitting alone in a corner booth on Christmas Eve without sitting down. That is who he was. That is what he did. He had done it before in other diners and other towns and would do it again. But this time it became something more than the moment itself. This time, the woman whose hand he put his hand over was 82 years old and had a grief she had been afraid to start and a laugh she had forgotten she still had and a quality of listening that made the men around her say true things they had been keeping for years. And this time it led to 5 Christmas Eves and a phone card worn soft as cloth, in a small book of biscuit recipes, in a ceramic horse, an inch and a half tall, in a plaque on a wall, in a diner in Calverton, North Carolina. From one chair pulled up at one corner booth. That is how it works. That is always how it works. You cannot engineer the moments that matter. You can only show up and stay and pay attention. And sometimes if the conditions are right and you are patient enough and present enough, the moment shows you what it is. Eleanor showed up. She stayed. She paid attention. For 87 years, she paid attention to Harold's hands and Harold's limp and Harold's cornbread and Harold's laugh and Harold's hand under the table, even after 53 years when he thought no one was looking. To her children, the specific weight of each of them, Sandra and Gary, the way Sandra organized her thoughts before she spoke, and the way Gary said yes before he finished understanding the question. Both of them some combination of Eleanor and Harold walking around in the world doing the things they were going to do. To Ruby's diner and the quality of the coffee and the way the booth seat felt in winter and summer, and what it meant to be welcomed somewhere reliably year after year until reliable became beloved. And on the last Christmas Eve of her life, she paid attention to Vance Holden walking through the door, which she had learned by then to expect, and still found worth attention the way you find worth attention, the things that matter, regardless of how many times they have happened. She watched him cross the room. She watched him sit down. She said his name, and he said hers, and she thought, here we are again, and meant it with the full weight of all the years of here we are again. Every one of them. That was the last year. She did not know it was the last year. You never know which one is the last one, which is simultaneously the saddest and most useful thing about time than not knowing, because if you knew, you would spend the whole of it grieving it rather than being in it, and being in it is the only thing that counts. She was in it. All the way to the end, she was in it. And the booth is still there, and the plaque is still there, and every December the floor begins to hum, and the headlights sweep the ceiling, and the door opens, and whoever is in the corner booth that night looks up, and there is room, and there is always room, and the evening begins.